Okay guys, here's what the headlines say today. CNN, BBC, Reuters, AP, pick your outlet. They're all running some version of the same story this morning. A Russian drone hit a passenger minibus in Kherson. 2 people are dead, 9 injured. Ukraine says it hit Russian fighter jets on the ground at an airbase in occupied Crimea. Ukraine just signed a deal with Sweden for 16 Gripen fighter jets. And somewhere in the background, everyone keeps repeating the same phrase, peace talks remain stalled. That's the story. Drones fly, people die, weapons get signed, talks don't happen. Rinse and repeat. But here's the thing nobody's really sitting with. This war just quietly crossed the threshold. And almost none of the daily coverage is built to notice thresholds. It's built to notice today's explosion, not the shape of the 4 months before it. Here's a data point that barely made a headline. Independent open source trackers, Deep State, which is Ukrainian OSINT, and the Institute for the Study of War, which is American, both published updates in the last 48 hours on territorial movement. From early May to early June, Russia's net territorial gain across the entire front was about 3 square miles. From June 2nd to June 30th, that number jumped to roughly 11 to 31 square miles, depending on which tracker you use. Sit with that for a second. That's not a rounding error. That's somewhere between a 3-fold and a 10-fold increase in the rate of advance. In a single month, right as the drone campaign against Russian territory has been getting louder and louder in Western headlines. Now put a second number next to it. A survey referenced this week by Russia Matters found 60% of Russians say they support peace negotiations. On the Ukrainian side, the number is even higher. 66% say their own government should be actively seeking to end the war as soon as possible. Does that make sense to you? Because here's the tension. The public on both sides increasingly wants out. And the battlefield trend line, at least this month, is moving in Russia's favor, not away from it. That's not the story you'd expect if the dominant narrative, Ukraine has quietly turned the tide, Russia is on the ropes, were actually true. It might still turn out to be true over a longer arc, but the most recent, most current data doesn't support the version of that story people are telling right now. So let's slow down and look at the shape. Now let's talk about paper, actual documents, not vibes. Go back to early June. The E3, that's the UK, France, and Germany, sat down with Zelensky in London and produced something described as 5 conditions for a just and lasting end to the war. Real security guarantees, insistence that any negotiation include Kyiv and wider European partners, not just Washington and Moscow in a room alone. Moscow's answer came fast, and it came from Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova, who said flatly that the conditions in that European statement were unacceptable to Russia. A few days earlier, the Kremlin had already made a separate point that talking peace while simultaneously helping Kyiv build new weapons capacity is, in their words, a case of actions not matching words. Here's why that exchange matters more than the drone footage. It tells you Russia is treating the European bloc and the peace process as 2 separate competing tracks, not one coordinated effort. And when you look at what the Europeans have actually been doing on the economic side in that same window, you can see why. The European Commission rolled out its 21st sanctions package in early June, explicitly targeting energy, financial services, crypto, and Russia's so-called shadow fleet of tankers used to dodge existing sanctions. That's not a document written by a neutral referee. That's a document written by one side of a fight, aimed at economically squeezing the other side, timed almost exactly alongside a stated European desire to be included at the negotiating table. But you don't have to think that's wrong. Plenty of people would argue it's exactly the right kind of pressure to apply to a country that invaded its neighbor. But you can't read that sanctions package and then describe the people who wrote it as a neutral mediator standing between 2 warring sides. Words matter, and mediator is not the honest word for the authors of that document. If you've spent any time on channels like this one, you've probably heard some version of the argument that drone strikes deep into Russian territory are a battle for perception, not a battle for territory. That argument's been floating around commentary circles for months now, long before this particular news cycle, and it's holding up. The drone campaign against Crimea and the Russian interior hasn't meaningfully slowed the Russian advance in Donbas. If anything, that advance sped up the same month the strikes intensified. That's worth remembering. The next time a headline treats a strike on a Moscow suburb as proof the war is turning. So here's a framework worth putting a name on because I think it explains a lot of what looks confusing about this war right now. Call it the negotiate while losing trap. It works like this. Step 1, a government's own public turns decisively against continuing the war, which per this week's polling has now happened on both the Russian and Ukrainian sides. Step 2, that same government cannot politically afford to be the one who proposes concessions first. because doing so looks like admitting the war wasn't worth what it cost. Step 3. Instead of negotiating from where things actually stand, each side tries to improve its bargaining position through military escalation, territorial gains, deep strikes, new weapons deals, hoping to walk into any eventual talks holding more cards. Step 4. That escalation extends the war, which increases public exhaustion, which loops back into step 1, except worse. It's a trap because the exit that both publics say they want, a negotiated end, actually requires each side to do the one thing its own domestic politics currently punishes: stop trying to win first. Zelensky's own open letter to Putin in early June makes this almost explicit. He argued there was little point waiting for American attention to return from other crises, and called directly for a face-to-face meeting. Putin's public answer wasn't an outright refusal to ever meet, it was a claim that a meeting is pointless unless Ukraine already commits to leaving Donbass first. Neither side is refusing to talk, both sides are refusing to be the one who moves first. Now let me push back on my own argument for a second, because that's only fair. The strongest version of the Ukraine is actually winning the broader war case doesn't rest on this month's territorial numbers at all. It rests on the economic and industrial war underneath the battlefield won. Denmark alone committed roughly $200 million in new direct funding defense aid to Ukrainian arms manufacturers in the same week these headlines dropped. The EU finalized a €90 billion two-year loan package back in the spring specifically to fund Ukrainian weapons production and energy infrastructure. Sweden's Gripen deal isn't symbolic, it's a multi-year fighter jet pipeline. If you zoom out to a 2 or 3 year horizon instead of a 1-month territorial snapshot, the argument goes, Ukraine's industrial base and Western backing are compounding in a way Russia's isolated economy simply cannot match over time, no matter what this month's frontline map looks like. That's a genuinely strong argument, and it might be right. The weakness in it is timing. Wars get settled by what each side believes about the next 12 months, not the next 5 years. And right now, Russian public messaging and the frontline trend line are both pointing toward we can still win something tangible soon, which is exactly the belief that makes leadership resistant to a deal today, regardless of what the 10-year industrial picture eventually looks like. This isn't a new shape. Historians who study attrition wars, the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s is probably the closest analog, will tell you the same thing happens almost every time. Both populations exhaust themselves well before either government is politically willing to admit exhaustion out loud. The fighting in that war dragged on for roughly 2 more years after most analysts agree both sides had effectively lost the ability to achieve their original war aims, purely because neither leadership could survive being the one who said so first. The mechanism isn't really about ideology or which side is right. It's about the domestic cost of being the government that ends a war on terms that can be framed as a loss. That's the pattern worth watching for here, not who has more drones, but who blinks politically first. Here's an angle that's barely making it into English language coverage. As of today, July 1st, Russia has begun suspending rail traffic at several checkpoints along its borders with Finland, Estonia, and Latvia. Officially, this is being framed as a routine administrative move, but it's landing at the exact moment those same countries are watching Russian drone incursions get reported near Romanian airspace, close enough that Ukraine and Romania felt the need to open a direct communication channel specifically to prevent future incidents. These are NATO members and NATO-adjacent states with essentially nothing to gain from this war continuing, and a great deal to lose if it starts leaking sideways across borders that were never part of the original fight. Sweden's own military intelligence chief said publicly this week that the Russian threat to the region will outlast Putin himself regardless of how this specific war ends, and notably added that his agency sees no sign Putin's actual grip on power inside Russia is under any real threat, despite the sanctions pressure. That's a striking admission from a Western intelligence official because it directly undercuts the Russia is collapsing from within version of events that's popular in some corners of Western commentary. So where does this actually go? Here are 3 concrete things worth tracking over the coming weeks, not vague vibes. 1. Whether Russia announces a new mobilization wave. Reporting this week indicates Moscow is treating additional mobilization as a genuine last resort, one more likely to happen only after State Duma elections rather than before. If a mobilization order comes down before those elections, that's a signal the Kremlin believes the current volunteer and conscript pipeline can no longer sustain the pace of this month's advances, meaning the acceleration in territorial gains may be short-lived rather than the start of a real breakthrough. 2. Whether the EU's new steel quotas, which took effect today, actually get carved out for Ukrainian producers. Ukrainian industry groups are already warning this measure. A 47% cut to tariff-free steel import allowances could seriously damage exactly the domestic industrial base the West says it wants to help Ukraine rebuild. If Brussels quietly exempts Ukraine in the coming weeks, that tells you European economic policy and European Ukraine policy are actually coordinated. If it doesn't get an exemption, that tells you they're not as aligned as the public statements suggest. 3. Watch for any actual face-to-face Zelensky-Putin meeting announcement, as opposed to another round of open letters. Right now, prediction markets tracking a near-term diplomatic meeting are pricing in fairly low odds, and Putin's own public position is that a meeting is pointless without a prior territorial commitment from Kyiv. If that precondition softens even slightly, that's the single clearest signal available that one side believes its negotiating position has peaked and is trying to lock in gains before its own momentum reverses. Look, I want to be upfront. Nobody watching this war closely has a monopoly on where it goes next, including me. Push back on me if you think I've got a piece of this wrong. Genuinely. Go check the deep state and ISW territorial data yourself. Read the actual EU sanctions package text. Look up the Russia Matters polling numbers directly rather than taking my summary of them. But here's the question I keep coming back to. If both populations at 60 and 66% say they want this war to end, and if the thing actually driving continued escalation isn't military necessity, but each government's fear of being the one who moves first, then what exactly would it take for either side to stop